So we are shifting gears a little bit with our discussion in this chapter, the feminist challenge. What we're going to be looking at is the concern that our moral theories that we've discussed so far, all offered by men, have left something important out. Philosophy, in large part, is a male-dominated field. And throughout history, men have been almost exclusively responsible for philosophical ideas. Some of our male philosophers thought women actually had something to offer. Some of our male philosophers thought that women were not rational creatures. So there's been a significant mix throughout history. In the probably maybe the 17th century, we start seeing, maybe the 18th century, we start seeing a few female voices being heard here and there. But it is not until the past 60 or 70 years that women's voices are becoming more prevalent. And with the introduction of feminism in society, we are finding more feminist critiques of our male-dominated theories. So just for the sake of being able to say we talked about it, let's talk about what we mean when we say feminism, because there is a negative connotation associated with this word in our society. People sometimes hear feminism or feminist and they automatically think of these people, mostly women, who take it to the extreme. You know, all men are bad. Anything a man does for a woman is subjugating her, it's oppressing her. And that's not what feminism is. There are extreme forms, of course, and there are far more popular, far more numerous not extreme positions. So let's just make sure we know what we're talking about. Lindemann claims that feminism is less about equality than it is about power. So many people will associate feminism with gender equality. Now, gender equality is important, of course, but the ramification of gender inequality is that the power is lopsided. With the inequality between men and women throughout history, men have had power over women. And Lindemann's point is that the feminist movement is about balancing that power rather than simply bringing about equality. Likewise, it's not about biology. There are biological differences between the genders. There's no denying that. But there are differences between men and women that go beyond biology. Biological differences are between males and females, but our gender differences, are the differences we look at in feminism, are between men and women, where we are moving from the biological sense to the sociological sense. There are differences between men and women. Historically, men have been in the position of power, women have been in domestic roles. Historically, men's voices are heard while women's voices are quieted. So it's these sorts of differences that feminism is examining and attempting to make sense of, rather than simply the fact that women have two X chromosomes and men have an X and a Y, or women bear children and men do not. So we're looking at the sociological and perhaps even the psychological differences rather than the biological. Our gender roles throughout history have reinforced these differences. As I said, historically, the man's role is to take care of the family, go to work, earn the money, and the women are supposed to stay at home and take care of the house and take care of the children. My grandmother, when one of I think it was my cousin, interviewed her for just a history project. She interviewed her and they were talking about her college career, and she asked, well, what degree did you get? She says, she goes, I got my MRS. I didn't get a BA or a BS. I got my MRS because 80 years ago, it was far more expected for a woman to get married than it was for her to get a college degree. And this continued in the 50s. The expectation was that the man graduates from college, gets a job because he has a wife to take care of and he will have children to take care of. And the woman was supposed to make sure she knew how to cook and clean so that she could keep the house and take care of the children. She had to be able to entertain, her husband's friends. So these were the gender roles. These differences, of course, did not only occur within the household. Certainly, they were very prevalent there. But academically, most fields have historically been dominated by men. Nurses and elementary, high school, those sorts of teachers, those were female-dominated fields of work. Nursing, secretarial positions, and teaching in the public school system, those we expected to find women doing those. But those individuals that got a college degree, then got a PhD and taught at the college level and did the research and so forth, those were all male-dominated, because they all take a great deal of work. And women have a difficult time getting a PhD and doing what they need to get tenure or make partner in a law firm or so forth, when she is expected to be at home taking care of the children. And what we saw was, even as more women moved into the business field, into law, into medicine, they were punished because they would end up having children. They would not make partner. They would not get tenure. So this is not just a domestic relationship. This has reached into the broader areas of society. So feminist ethicists discuss these differences in the context of moral inquiry. So there are a lot of different ways we can discuss feminism. We can talk about feminism in regards to medicine and domestic life, but feminist ethicists are centering that discussion around morality. How does the introduction of the female perspective alter our moral theories? And it's not just moral theories for this action and that action, but we can expand it to societal justice. So that's what we're going to be talking about. So feminist ethics. Feminist ethics charges that rights and view of women have been ignored in ethics. And this isn't a stretch, right? When we largely look at so many of our moral theories, they will not focus on the rights of women. it took a long time for women to get the, right to vote, and women to have the right to, do whatever they wanted. And when it comes to moral theories, there were so many more male moral theorists that just believed women were not rational creatures. They were not part of the moral community. Feminist ethics tends to emphasize personal relationships over impartiality. One of the things that we see consistently within Kantian morality and utilitarianism and natural law theory is this consistency of impartiality. Everybody's interests are equal, and I am not supposed to take your interests give your interests further weight than I do a stranger. Oh, well, my mom is in trouble, but 5 people are also in trouble. Utilitarianism is going to say you probably have to help those 5 people. Despite the fact that she's my mom, I have to weight each person's interests equally. Whereas feminist ethicists come along and say, no, that's not quite right, because personal relationships are incredibly important. They are, what make us human. And so we can't expect people to ignore those. So when we look at a moral theory, we have to look at the circumstances and relationships of those involved. We need to really be considering all of it. And again, while utilitarianism and ethical egoism look at the consequences and thus the circumstances, what our feminist ethicists are doing is taking that a step further. If I am in a moral dilemma, then I need to look at not only, things like justice, but I need to consider, what are my relationships with these people and how is that going to be impacted? If I break a promise to my friend to help these 3 strangers, is my friend going to be understanding? Is my friend going to be put in further danger? Might my friendship be harmed? Now, if the answer is yes, that doesn't necessarily mean you help the friend. You might have a crappy friend, but you have to take all of that into account. So it's no longer all of these people's interests are equal. I need to take into account my relationship with the individuals. Is that making sense? So what we're seeing is that feminist ethicists have a larger role for emotions in morality rather than merely rationality. Now, we saw early on in the semester that one of the properties of morality is that it is reason-based. And feminist ethicists aren't telling us to ditch rationality. We still need reason. If we act solely on our emotions, we run the risk of acting wrongly. If I'm angry because I find my significant other in bed with somebody else and I decide to shoot them, that's letting my emotions take over, and that's not a good thing. No moral theorist thinks that's a good thing. But using rationality and only rationality and not allowing emotions to play any kind of role dehumanizes us. We're turning ourselves into automatons. We're not granting that part of the human experience, and part of moral experience is these emotions we have with individuals that we have close relationships with. So feminist ethicists want us to take that into account in examining moral situations. Does that make sense? The personal is political. This is a product of observations made regarding societal treatment of domestic roles, and familial relationships. The private domestic domain needs to be in the public eye. Okay, so we talked about how historically women stay at home, take care of the house, take care of the children, and the man goes off to work. Okay, working moms were rather uncommon 60 or 70 years ago. So when we have a situation, where we have the mom at home and she's taking care of the children and she talks to the children about what goes on at school and she talks to the children about problems they might have with other people, and the man comes home, they all sit down for dinner and they have a nice civil conversation, but the father is emotionally detached from these conflicts that the children might be having. If any of you grew up in what I consider a typical 50s family, and that doesn't mean you had to grow up in the 50s, you could have grown up in the 70s, but you had that typical 50s family, you might understand what I'm talking about. Dad comes home and he chastises the children, mom says to chastise, and he praises the children, mom says to praise, but then he sort of moves on. He doesn't get involved in the conflict. Those men that aren't getting involved in the conflicts are also the men that are lawyers and judges and legislators. They are the ones who are making laws and monitoring or moderating conflicts in the legal system. These are not people that are involved in those daily lives. And so what we've seen throughout history, well, not even throughout history, we've seen laws, legislature be very focused on, the male roles and ignoring those female ones. But even as women's lib came to be in our country, right? So in the 70s and 80s, we're seeing more and more women break into these male fields, become doctors, become lawyers, become business people. Nonetheless, we also had a lot more discussion of things like abortion in society. Well, men in the 80s who wanted to be at home with their children, who wanted to participate in their family lives, were chastised or made fun of in the workplace. They had less opportunity to be made partner in a law firm or to get tenure at the academic level. The people who made it that far were making laws about how the relationships between children and parents were supposed to go on. For example, after Roe v. Wade in the 70s, states started to make individual laws regarding later term abortions and abortions regarding minors. And so, states would make laws like anybody under the age of 18 who wants an abortion has to have parental consent from both parents or a judge's order permitting it. Okay, so imagine that you've got a girl who's 16 and she's been molested by her father, and now she needs to go to dad and get permission to have an abortion. Or imagine the young girl whose father took off on her and her mom at the age of 6, and they haven't heard from him since, but she has to track him down to get permission to get an abortion. Or she has to go in front of a man sitting behind the bench in the courtroom to get permission. The concern is that these relationships between parent and children, husband and wife, are, or rather certainly were, maybe still are, being diminished and ignored because they're not in the public eye. So household and family roles are as important, we will say, as the roles played by doctors, lawyers, and legislators. Doctors, lawyers, and legislators can't have children if they don't have somebody, helping out, taking care of the children. They're not going to have clean suits to wear to work if they don't have somebody helping out with the dry cleaning, that sort of thing. And I know those are the antiquated ways of looking at things. That's men can pick up their own dry cleaning now. But in the 80s, when we're looking at this, the 80s, early 90s even, there was this concern that these household and family roles were being diminished. If you've heard, there are a number of, you can hear a number of divorce stories where the woman stayed home and didn't work and took care of the house and took care of the children, and then hubby went off and had an affair with the secretary, and then leaves the wife or the younger secretary, and all of a sudden she's left with nothing. There is a big movement that no, her role was just as important as him. He has lots of money from being a powerful lawyer. He needs to be handing some of that over to her. So this is one of those ways we're seeing this idea be played out in society and in law. So women in high-powered roles have traditionally been punished for having children. And men wanting to be involved in the family have been ridiculed and ostracized. It's not a surprise that a very small percentage of senators and representatives in Congress have been women, even now are women. We might have more women in the legislature now than we ever have before, but we also have this situation where when we count up all of this legislature since, the Constitution was enacted in 1789, we have big problems because the percentage of women is so very small. And so men have been expected to do that, and they were not expected to show emotion and get on the floor and play with their children. They weren't expected to be stay-at-home dads. Now, all of that has been changing significantly in the past 20 or 30 years, but it's been a hard road. If any of you are familiar with it, and if you're not, you should look it up. In the 80s, there was a movie with Michael Keaton called Mr. Mom. And he got fired or laid off or something. And so his wife went back to work, and he stayed at home with the kids, who were relatively young. And it's just, of course, this ensuing comedy about how he was really not ready to take care of these children and didn't know what really needed to be done. So, this is to the best of my knowledge, the first real introduction of that idea. And it was over 30 years ago. So men were not supposed to be at home. Women were not supposed to be in high-powered roles. They were not supposed to have people who were lawyers and doctors and CEOs of companies who also were involved in the domestic life. But we've been seeing a shift in that, and of course, still working towards that. The bottom line is, our feminist ethicists will tell us that true equality, a true balance of power, may not be achieved until we view all of these roles equally. We understand the value of the domestic roles is equal to the value of the public legislator roles. Does that make sense? So now let's talk about Carol Gilligan. In the 1950s, a gentleman by the name of Lawrence Kohlberg did a study on how children develop their moral principles, how the development of moral education, over the course of growing up. And to do so, he studied young boys, he studied older boys, teenage boys, men. He studied boys from all sorts of different cultures. He studied boys from different socioeconomic backgrounds. He really covered his bases there, and he studied these boys and how they developed. And he discovered that early on, like 4 years old, they're most interested in self-preservation. And that doesn't mean, survival. It means not getting in trouble. So they might lie to mom and dad so they don't get in trouble. If you've ever met a 3 or 4 year old, and you think they lie an awful lot, that's why, because they're trying to avoid getting in trouble. They're really bad at lying, so of course parents know what they're doing. I'll never forget when my friend, her son got to be about 3 or 4, and she's like, he is always lying. She was just convinced, I think, on some level he was going to be a sociopath. And I'm like, of course he was. He's 4. He's trying not to get into trouble. It's just part of growing up. As they get older, as they reach reach those double digits in their early teens, they are more interested in being seen as good people. They are more interested in following the rules. As teenagers, they are intent on knowing what the rules are. Of course, teenagers test the rules, but they equate those rules with being good people. They do what they can to be seen as good people. And as they become men, they have a tendency to equate moral principles with legal laws. So if it's against the law to do this, they tend to equate that with it also being immoral. The gold ring in this moral development, Kohlberg said, and not a lot of men make it there. A small percentage of men make it to that final stage where they can separate out moral principles and legal laws. They can examine morality as an abstract notion outside of what is dictated by society. So he did this study, and then he said, after he studied all of these boys, he said, and girls develop the same way. Did y'all pick up on the problem here? He didn't study any girls. He studied a whole bunch of boys, a wide variety of boys, and then he extrapolated to women. Carol Gilligan comes along in the 70s and says, I'm not so wild about that. So she performs her own study where she studies boys and girls and their moral development. She discovered that boys develop exactly like Kohlberg said. But girls are different. Girls start off at the same level, self-preservation, I don't want to get in trouble. But as they grow older, they shift to a moral perspective that focuses on nurturing and relationships with others. So they focus on this need to help other people, take care of other people. As they grow older, they are focused on taking care of children, but also perhaps aging grandparents or parents. And they struggle with how to balance taking care of themselves, but also all of these other people. The gold ring here is to find that balance, to be able to take care of children, aging parents, but also be able to take care of yourself. What she saw was there is a difference in the way men and women, boys and girls, look at morality. She asked a group of 10-year-olds, boys and girls, about that classic scenario where a man's wife is sick, but he can't afford the money to get the medication, and she's going to die without it. Does he break into the pharmacy and steal the medication to save her life, or does he not, and he has to watch her die? The boys all answered break in or don't break in. They were sort of black and white. It's wrong to break into this place and steal, so you don't do that. Or it's wrong to let the wife die, so you have to break in. But the girls asked more questions. They wanted to know about the relationship between the man and the husband and wife, or the man and the pharmacist. They wanted to know if a compromise couldn't be found between the pharmacist and the husband. They looked in that gray area. They were more concerned about the relationships between these people than simply right and wrong, black and white. So what Gilligan has given us is there is a difference in gender moral perspectives. The male moral perspective is one of impartiality and justice. Men focus on everybody's interests being equal. They focus on justice. It's just to get the medicine and save the life, or it's not just to break in and steal. But the female moral perspective is more about connectedness and relatedness between individuals. So the female moral perspective is one where they're more interested in the relationships between the parties involved and how that impacts what ought to be done. Now, this is all back in the 70s, okay? Women's lib, you can't see me, but I kind of put that in quotes, not because I think it's a bad thing, but because the phrase is so cliche. You know, women's lib was in its infancy in so many ways in the 70s. And we had children who had grown up with those classic gender roles. Dad went out, got money, brought home the bacon, so to speak. Mom stayed home and took care of the house and the kids. And so boys were learning that what they were supposed to do was grow up, get a job, get married, and be able to provide for their families, whereas girls were learning that they were supposed to take care of the house, take care of the children. The question now, when we look ahead 40 years, is were these different perspectives that Gilligan observed in these children, were they a product of nature or nurture? Is it the case that women are simply built in such a fashion that their natural moral perspective is one of connectedness and relatedness? And boys, men, are created just biologically, it's ingrained for impartiality and justice? Or was it that that's what they were learning from the gender roles prevalent in society? You know, fast forward 40 years, we have more women in high-powered roles. We have more men taking an active role in taking care of the house and taking care of the children. My best friend has a house husband. She works and he stays at home and takes care of the kids. Now, she comes home and they both do housework and they both do cooking, but he doesn't have a job. She, quote unquote, brings home the bacon. I have another friend who her husband works full time, she works part time, but he cooks dinner as often as she does. So we're seeing more men take on these domestic roles. Now, what is that a product of? Is it a product of simply that more men grew up seeing what, women should do and being taught to do what women do? Or is it that we have more men that were raised by single mothers and forced to learn how to do that sort of stuff and help out around the house? Of course, it's hard to say. I don't have any authority to come down on one side or another. It's just that what we're seeing over the course of 40 years since Gilligan, did her study, was that there seems to be more of a meshing of the male and female moral perspective. Perhaps more women have views of impartiality and justice, and more men have views of connectedness and relatedness. Perhaps we have men and women who look at all of those as equal. So did the study discover something that is natural and ingrained, part of our biology, or did it discover something that was simply a product of our societal gender roles? Something to think about. Ethics of care is what we get out of all of this. Ethics of care advocates for the virtues of caring and empathy as a moral system. Ethics of care as a moral theory does not give us the nice, neat little formula, and action is right if X, where it fills in X. It doesn't give us that sort of formula like we get from Kantian morality or utilitarianism. Ethics of care wants to show that virtues like caring and empathy are at least as important as virtues like impartiality and justice and honesty. Impartiality, they say, pure, unadulterated impartiality results in dehumanizing people. We turn ourselves into automatons where we're not supposed to give our mother's interest more importance than some stranger off the street. And ethics of care says that's just not natural. That takes away, the specialness we have of people, that human person that has not only the capability to reason, but also those emotional ties to the people around us. And while we might find feminist ethicists that want to move to the extreme where they have a moral theory that is only about caring and empathy, we have far more that say perhaps what we need to do is find a balance between impartiality and caring. Impartiality is important. Reason and rationality are important, but caring and other emotions are also important. And what we need to do to have a good moral theory is to find a way to balance those. If I've made a promise to my mom to meet her for lunch, but I have the chance to save a life that results in breaking that promise, perhaps impartiality there can kick in a little bit. But if I've made a promise to help my mother go to chemotherapy treatments, but some stranger wants me to just walk around the block and look for a puppy, then maybe caring about my mom and providing moral support is more important there. You get the idea? We have to find a balance, and it's not an easy thing to find, but it's something to think about. Okay? Is this making sense? All right, well, if you have any confusions, remember, rewind, re-listen. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Just remember that you need to sign your email or I won't respond. Have a great day.